Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm David Rand. I'm a faculty member at MIT in marketing and in brain and cognitive sciences. And I do a lot of research on misinformation, why people share it, what to do about it, and also regularly advise technology companies on approaches to deal with misinformation. And I'm really excited to be hosting this panel today. On the panel with me, we have Tom Cunningham, who's a fellow with the Integrity Institute and worked previously as an economist and a data scientist at Facebook and Twitter. So has a unique perspective from inside both of those organizations. Before that, he was on the economics faculty at Stockholm University and has spent time as a visiting scholar at Harvard, Tel Aviv University, and Caltech. And he works on content moderation, experimentation, and company strategy. As continuing academic work on identifying implicit preferences in decision-making. And then we'll also have Kate Klonick, who's an associate professor of law at St. John's University Law School and an affiliate fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale Law School and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. And for this 2022-2023 academic year, she's a visiting scholar down the street at Harvard University's Rebooting Social Media Initiative. Her research focuses on private governance of online speech, for example, her groundbreaking work on the development of Facebook's oversight board. So I'm really excited for this panel to have a sort of industry perspective, a kind of legal perspective, and social science perspective to think together about the problem of misinformation and what should and should not be done to try to reduce the spread of misinformation online. So to kick things off, we're going to start with some introductory remarks. We'll have Tom go first. So Tom, take it away.
Thank you, Dave. Pleasure to be talking. So I'm going to, Dave already gave a good introduction of what my background is. I've worked a lot on thinking about content moderation and misinformation trade-offs within platforms, of trying to figure out what are good ways of identifying misinformation and especially what's the appropriate way of making trade-offs between other outcomes. I'm going to run through just briefly 4 or 5 kind of facts that I think are useful framing devices for where that problem stands, both sort of extremely big picture historical and also some more specific stuff with respect to platforms. So one is, I think it's a fair generalization to say misinformation is much more common on decentralized media. So obviously, on social media, it's well known that it has much higher prevalence, but also on messaging networks, I think it's true for email, for chain letters, for person-to-person rumors. Those are the type of substrates which tend to generate a lot of misinformation compared to traditional centralized media like newspapers, radio, television. So an important note is that relationship's partly reversed in authoritarian societies where the centralized media tend to tell things which might be not true, and the decentralized media might be where the true things come out. The second observation is that although the prevalence of misinformation has been high on social media, it has fallen a great deal on the big platforms. I think on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, after about 2016, it's fallen by very large factors. So let's say on the order of 5 or 10, a factor of 5 or 10, the rate of the prevalence of misinformation has decreased. I think there's 2 interpretations of why misinformation is more common on decentralized media, and they both have some truth, but it's actually quite critical to think about what is the reason why when we're thinking about both regulation and also internal platforms. The 2 reasons are, one, I think the decentralized media are by their nature bad at assessing the quality of content, in the sense that people tend to click whatever's shiny, whatever looks good, but not what is good. And so people end up the type of stuff which propagates on decentralized media is stuff which is only superficially good, which is selective for misinformation. Whereas centralized media, they have a business incentive to not show misleading headlines because they'll lose readership. So that's one argument of why decentralized media has higher rates of misinformation. The second is that actually people want to see misinformation, but centralized media restrain themselves. That centralized media could get a lot more readership if they started showing whatever readers want to read, but for whatever reason, they restrain themselves. It's difficult to distinguish in those stories. There's some truth, I think, of both of them. And then I'll just say 2 more brief things. One is that the most effective interventions, I think, of misinformation, why those rates have fallen so much, is essentially if you're trying to kill malaria, get rid of malaria, you drain the swamp where the mosquitoes are reproducing. I think that that's the metaphor of thinking about how these platforms have reduced misinformation. They've reduced all the ways in which it propagates. They've added friction on politics, on sharing, on viral content, on certain types of reactions, on content from new producers, on content from fringe producers, on something that looks like clickbait. They've added dozens and dozens of different interventions, all of which combined have massively decreased the rate of misinformation, but they're all pretty low precision. So they've also had huge, anything which looks a little bit like misinformation is going to tend to get suppressed as well. So that's a big worry, that all sorts of stuff is going away along with the misinformation. And finally, I think an important point is that internally you can ask, how are platforms making these decisions? What is their North Star? What are they maximizing? I think an important truth is that they don't have a super clear North Star. So they're responsive to half a dozen different constituencies. They're responsive to the media, to governments, to advertisers, to the users, to the employees, to the investors. All of those people have very strong opinions about what content should be on the platform. And as someone who works, if you're in charge of trust and safety for a big platform, you have to be responsive to every single one of those constituents. You can't say, here's my metric, which I'm going to maximize. Every day you have to be aware that one of these constituents is going to have some complaint, and you have to be ready to respond to it. So unfortunately, there's no simple way of characterizing exactly what the maximization problem is or what the North Star is for trust and safety within a big platform.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's a lot of interesting points there. I'm already writing down notes of all the things that I want to talk about that's come out of that. Kate, do you want to give some opening remarks?
Yeah, that was a perfect start. Tom, thank you so much. So I kind of want to pick up on your remarks and I'll respond a bit. One of the things that I was happy to hear you say was that misinformation has actually gotten better on the platforms, which I think is something that is actually most true. And you also kind of mentioned this with the centralization versus decentralization. If we think about places like Facebook and places like Twitter, the biggest of the big user-generated content platforms, we can kind of identify that those are mostly centralized compared to other types of networks, other types of things like Reddit is comparatively decentralized, things like that. And so I think that that's actually a super important point, because I think it's contrary to what we've been hearing a lot over the last, 4 or 5 years, in which misinformation has become a problem that the public is taking seriously in its consciousness. Because I think there's been a lot to attack the largest of the large platforms in a way that is kind of like you're the ABC News of which actually is maybe a good thing. The fact that there was some type of centralization in which this was spreading, and therefore there was one place in which there could be intervention to drain the swamp. I think that in the next couple of years, what we're going to have is all of these puddles that are like all over the place where mosquitoes are breeding and the misinformation is breeding, and it's going to be very difficult to track each of those down. To completely beat your metaphor into the ground, Tom, sorry about that. But I do think that this is, I think that this is another thing that I was going to say was that I loved your mention of authoritarian versus democratic kind of governments, and kind of the idea of bringing government into this, because I'm, my training is in cognitive science, is in law, obviously. But as a lawyer, I think that there is also a huge kind of gap in public consciousness about what it is exactly that we expect from truth and what it is that we think that the law is going to be able to do for truth. There is no, I think as a philosopher, you know that these are epistemological problems, that they're kind of like, it's hard to know what truth is in any context, and that context shifts and changes. And in a decentralized place where people have a million different social meanings that they're posting any given information for, that changes and is constantly changing a lot, is illegible to people that are outside that context. And so I think that that's important to keep in mind, because it's actually a really important part of a free society that we have that flexibility and that freedom. And so one of the things that I think has been one of the very unpopular things that I think that I have said over the last 5 years, but I think is ultimately true, is that like the law does not have a role in a free society to necessarily play in trying to determine truth or not truth. This is the realm of like kind of trying to swat mosquitoes, and you don't like kind of use like a nuclear bomb on mosquitoes. You decide to kind of target these in more constructive, pragmatic ways. And sometimes that is the realm of people who understand these, that are in the private platform governance space, where they're experts in exactly how to create friction in these spaces and slow things down. The other thing that I guess I'll just say is, and then I'll kind of close, is that I think that AI is going to be kind of an interesting and new development in this. And I have seen that just since in the last like couple of months, like all of us have been watching with interest, and I've been speaking to a lot of people who are working on alignment issues within the companies and trying to figure out these problems of, again, we kind of, everyone pops out this, well, can we sue for defamation? Can we sue these companies? Are we going to hold these companies liable for the lies? Are they creating the lies? Who's creating? I don't think it matters. I think that what's really interesting, one of the most interesting things that I've heard is someone say to me, well, like, we can re-aim AI to be less certain. And if it's less certain, it will be more truthful and it will give you fewer answers. It will say, I don't know, because actually, to be like perfectly honest, very few of us know very much. Like a lot of things are mostly uncertain. And so if you want AI to be more certain and more truthful, it will have a lot of bad answers. It will have a lot of non-answers. And so that is kind of an interesting limitation on this technology that I think that people are not considering, is this line between certainty and truth. And I think as scientists, we can all kind of sit and understand that for a second. But I wish that there was more of a focus on that specific trade-off, because I do think that there is, I do think that it is a fascinating one. And I think AI is rendering it legible for the first time, but it's been there lurking under the surface for the last 5 or 6 years that we've been having this conversation.
Yeah, totally. That's so interesting. And I think to pick up one thread that you were saying there, Kate, like before I started working on misinformation, when I was a kind of like a consumer in the world, in 2016, and everyone was worried about fake news spreading on Facebook or whatever, I was kind of like, oh well, this seems like an easy problem. There's the things that are true and there are the things that are false, and if the platform wanted to do something about it, they could just get rid of the false stuff. And the fact that they're not, and that it's spreading, indicates that they just like don't care about the problem. And then when I started actually working on this stuff, and in particular working with tech companies, and then like looking at the actual kinds of stuff that they were trying to make decisions about, I was like, oh God, this is like way more complicated than I had appreciated. It's like there's a very small set of content that you can say, well, this is clearly false, or well, this is clearly true. But it's more like there's this continuum, and most of the content is somewhere in the middle. And I think that for me, it's not a kind of like post-truth, well, therefore there is no truth, and so there's no point in any of this, or it's everyone has their own opinion or whatever. Like, I think that there is some underlying sense of accuracy or truthfulness or something like that. It's just that it's hard to measure. And so even like we've done work with professional fact checkers and a bunch on professional fact checking, which to me is still the sort of best gold standard that we have for like how accurate something is. But like there's certainly not universal agreement among professional fact checkers. You get disagreement, but like because it's like this sort of accuracy is like a hard thing to measure with certainty. But there's still some signal there, because although there's not perfect agreement, if you get a bunch of fact checkers, there's general, the correlation between their judgments is high. It's just not one. And so I think that this issue of how you deal with this stuff in the middle is like really one of the biggest questions. That it's interesting to think about the role that that AI is going to play there. I hadn't really thought about that in that particular framing. Something that we have done a lot of work on in my research group is the extent to which you can, or platforms could use the wisdom of crowds to try and get a handle on accuracy in a scalable way. One of the limitations of fact checkers is there aren't very many of them, even in the US, where there's a robust history of fact checking and so on. And much of the world, there's really none of that. And so you can rely on algorithms that try and classify things as misinformation or not. But sort of as Tom was alluding to, it's hard. And so there's lots of false positives or false negatives. And so the classifiers are great because they can do things at great scale, but the precision's not great. And so we found that maybe surprisingly, aggregating something like 15 or 20 judgments of lay people rating headlines and leads will give you about as much agreement with the fact checkers as you have amongst the fact checkers themselves. And again, it's because it's all a little bit murky, but when you can use the crowds to sort of shine light on things in a scalable way. Yeah, and I guess the other piece of that is that our work suggests that most people, like lay people, or let's say regular social media users, do actually care about the truth. People really don't want to share content that's inaccurate. And I think there's a perception that we're in this post-truth world where everyone is, super polarized and happily going around spreading claims they know that are false because they want to advance some kind of agenda. But I think that is not reflective of almost all social media users, who are the sort of like regular people who are like amplifying bad content. Our work suggests largely accidentally. Either because they're confused or because they're just not paying attention to whether it's accurate or not, because the social media context focuses their attention on all this other stuff, like who else shared it, all these sort of social factors. And so people forget to even do that first cycle of, oh, is this accurate or not? And so then I think that there's this important distinction between most of the people who don't want to share things that are inaccurate, but just aren't it's not their top priority, so they're not paying super attention to it, versus I think that there are sort of political elites or sort of advocates or something like that that are maybe more purposely creating the disinformation and putting it out there, but then how it's amplified, I think, is often by people that are not trying to do it on purpose. I think one topic that comes out of what both of you mentioned and what I was just saying is when you're thinking about interventions against misinformation, there is this question of how important is it to really specifically target misinformation versus shooting with a sort of wider net that also catches lots of things that are not problematic. Like, how do you think of the success of an intervention that reduces belief in false claims, but also reduces belief to some extent in true claims, or that reduces the sharing of false claims while also reducing the sharing of true claims to some extent? And so, to what extent is it important for interventions to really be sort of laser focused on the bad content? I'm curious what sort of both of you think about that.
I think this is you.
Okay, I'll start off. So I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is I think that as a general observation about how these projects have worked out inside tech companies, is that I think a big lesson, I think a lot of people would agree with me, the lesson of the last decade is to be opinionated about quality pays off, in the sense of, instead of just saying we're going to give the user what they want, subject to maybe some regulatory constraints, that actually to try and say we're going to try and provide high quality content to users. I personally think, and I think a lot of people from inside tech companies would probably agree that that's a good strategy, in the sense that, as an example, I think Facebook had almost a lost decade of bad quality public content of the stuff that was circulating. The top pages, the top shared posts were just overwhelmingly clickbait, bad faith actors, some teenagers from Kosovo who'd set up a pretend, page pretending to be different from what it was. But there was a kind of and people internally at Facebook were aware of this, but there was a kind of philosophical hesitancy to interfere with the free market of clicks and shares and likes, which in retrospect was a real own goal. It was a mistake, and public content on Facebook is now much better. And not only does that mean that Facebook has less negative headlines about it, but it's good for the company. It means that people are engaging much more with the high quality public content because it's not clickbait, because it's actually like more engaging stuff. And I think you saw a similar evolution a decade earlier at Google, that they switched to being, I think it was 2012, they had the Pandas update where they switched to having a whole bunch of raters, human raters, who would rate the quality of websites and then train models on that. So they became much more opinionated about quality. I think Twitter is a slightly more complicated story, but I think that overall, the companies have had both commercial success and also have managed to clean up their public image by being more opinionated about quality. And so I think that's what comes to mind with respect to your question about should we just narrowly focus on information. I think the ideal is to be opinionated about quality and cultivate a sense of professionalism internally to say, yes, we're going to try and be the platform that distributes high quality content, not just the platform which maximizes retention or likes or time spent or whatever it is. And that also means that you're going to have much happier employees, I think, because they're going to be more mission driven.
But I guess then if that's the target, the question would be, okay, so if we say we want to be the platform that has high quality content, sort of implicit in that is therefore the platform that don't have low quality content, right? Or that's suppressing the low quality content. And then I guess the question is how, it sort of seems like what you're saying is if the goal is have mostly high quality content, it's okay if a bunch of high quality content also gets suppressed if along the way, as long as you're not emptying the inventory or whatever, that it's okay to take out, as long as you're getting rid of the low quality content, it's okay for some high quality content to go with it.
Yeah, I think that's a super difficult problem. That's right, and that is certainly happening, and I find that a difficult trade-off to have a clear framework to think about that a whole bunch of stuff which happens to look like misinformation for one reason or another, or happens to look like low quality content, is just going to be thrown away. And if it was selected at random, it kind of wouldn't matter so much. I'll tell a funny story just briefly, that there was a classifier at Facebook at a certain point in time which tried to predict whether something was misinformation by a post having a lot of comments which said, I don't believe this, or I think it's fake. And I was having a look at false positives, and I realized there are a lot of photos of Australia there in the false positives, things which were not misinformation or identified misinformation. There were photos of like some crazily large spider or some enormous bushfire, or there was stuff that a whole bunch of people from outside of Australia would be like, that's got to be Photoshopped, I don't believe that. And so the comments would all be like, that's total fake, that's Photoshop. But of course they were true, it's just they're in Australia. So it's not random, the false positives are not random. It means that crazy natural phenomena from Australia, they're not getting distribution on Facebook. This was a while ago. I'm sure that things are somewhat better now, but coming back to your point, there is a real deficit, a real worry that there is non-random collateral damage, and it's quite difficult to think about how to make that trade-off.
I will just follow up briefly and say that, like, I do think that over the last maybe 10 to 15 years, we have developed a situation sense as a society around doubting our certainty of certain types of truth. And I actually think that, like, after the 2016 election, a lot of work was actually done in kind of the fear of fake news and the awareness that suddenly spread about misinformation and disinformation, and the fact that there were malicious actors purposefully spreading disinformation and that misinformation was a problem. I think that it increased our skepticism as a society. I mean, fake news became literally like kind of like a slander. If you could like post on someone's comments feed or like say something, it was like, oh, that's fake news. I mean, people really did start to doubt this, and I'm sure there is some heuristic that I am like forgetting the name of, but like the idea that because it came, they saw it online, or they saw it from something, that they falsely attribute authority to it, or that they over attribute authority to it because they read it somewhere, or like whatever it is. people really did begin checking the sources and caring about that. And so I do think that like there is, in a sense, in the same way that, you know, and I know that people say this, but I do think that like the comparison, the normative comparison to things like the printing press are somewhat relevant. Like it's not just that the printing press was created and destroyed institutions of knowledge that were primarily run by gatekeeper monks, and that this was this huge democratizing force of information. Before it was all of those things, people had to learn how to read. And then we had to develop like educational systems to teach people how to read. And like all of those things took generations to actually kind of come to fruition. And relatively quickly, I think that people have, and this is not to say this problem is solved or that we shouldn't worry about this or anything, but I do think that just in the last 5 to 6 years, learning that we are going to have, there might be a decline overall in good and bad information, and just by slowing down information. But I also think that people have developed a situation sense for clickbait, a situation sense for videos that they view. Why was there a camera like right there aimed at right that? Like, you know, just certain types of skepticism that have made their way into society that I think are ultimately pretty interesting and relevant in terms of normative responses that society has developed just in an incredibly rapid time frame.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I think that, you know, there has been a lot of discussion, as you said, around the consequences of this sort of public awareness or concern about misinformation and disinformation. And a lot of the work that I've seen in that space has been seeing this as to some extent a negative thing, in so much as it's undermining trust in institutions, certainly trust in the press, but also just like a general skepticism is not necessarily advantageous. Like if most of the content that you see is reasonably accurate, then decreasing your belief across the board is going to make your beliefs less accurate on average. And that, like, yeah, I think this is one of the major classes of anti-misinformation interventions are like literacy, digital literacy, media literacy type interventions. And
it's like the worst possible thing you can tell people, by the way. No one wants to hear like more education is like the response to something. It's like, but yeah. I mean, like just speaking from experience, like policymakers are like, no, let's pass a bill that does nothing and says nothing and is impossible to enforce, but I can get credit for it. And it's like, no, like there just is going to be, if you really want to solve this problem, it's a much longer solution.
Totally. And so I think that's totally right. I think that's a general theme, is that for all of this stuff, there's not like a simple, easy solution that is quick and then just like solves everything. But I think with the media literacy stuff, there's clearly evidence that some of that works and, you know, helps people learn what to pay attention to, what to be on the lookout for. But I think that there's also a real danger that a lot of the literacy programs or literacy interventions actually just make people more generally skeptical. And, you know, if you have a program that says, you know, basically, watch out, there's lots of fake news out there, you know, you can't believe anything you see on social media, and then that results in people just not believing any of the things they see on social media, that's not necessarily, or in my opinion, generally like a positive outcome, because it's just creating disbelief. And obviously there are certain misinformation campaigns that are trying to persuade people of particular positions, but also a lot of the disinformation campaigns, like I think some of the Russian stuff is notorious for this. The goal isn't to push any particular narrative, it's just to create general confusion and make people disbelieve things across the board and breed general disbelief and skepticism. So I think it's like quite important when you are doing anti-misinformation interventions to make sure you aren't doing the misinformation's work for it, of just generally making people disbelieve. And I think that this is an important difference in what we are talking about here, about what people believe versus what Tom was talking about of what the platform shows people. And so I think that like saying we're going to reduce belief in both accurate and inaccurate information is a much bigger problem than saying we're going to reduce the exposure of inaccurate or problematic content, and along the way we're also going to reduce the exposure of some good content. Like I think there's this difference between like how you affect what people believe versus how you affect what people see or share. Yeah. So I think that another question is sort of related to this, and it seems like a really important, like, overall question in this space is, what are the incentives that social media companies have to deal with this problem? To what extent is regulation or the threat of regulation an important stick, which seems like, Kate, you were saying maybe you're not a big fan of. To what?
Oh, not a big, I mean, like, it's an important stick. It's just kind of like in the United States, it's not going to be it's not going to be a super relevant one.
I guess that's a question, is like, how much do you think that even if it's not that relevant on its own, is the threat, how powerful is the threat? Yeah, I don't know. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the threat of misinformation regulation is, I think, different than the threat of regulation generally. As I said before, kind of, I want to also, there was a question that kind of came in that was kind of like, well, in a free society, you can have anarchy. And like, I'm not talking about kind of anarchy or like getting rid of the rule of law at all. I was just kind of, I'm referencing kind of the idea that a lot of people have said that there is and a desire to like ban. I've just, for the last 4 or 5 years, heard lots of people say things like, let's just ban misinformation, let's just ban like this types of content. And those types of ideas, those substantive, those ideas of like substantively banning a certain type of content based on like a subjective judgment is just not going to be in line with First Amendment principles at all. And so, and it's also kind of important that we have a wide range of like lies are protected by the First Amendment, specific reasons. Like, I mean, there are a lot there, and one of them is like scientific inquiry, and one of them is kind of the idea that like the best ideas will reach the top, and that having certain types of like all different types of content leads to better content. There are parameters that we're realizing that the law plays a really important role in. And I would say that like, it's important to have a consciousness about like what the law, when I say the law, meaning kind of architectural or design based kind of incentives, like Tom is talking about when he talks about slowing down types of like certain types of friction that are content neutral based kind of changes versus content based changes, which is like ban Fox News or ban the Babylon Bee or ban NewYorkTimes.com, like whatever it is that you're going to kind of say that you think is the source of it, misinformation, versus making types of like changes that are going to affect all types of negative content and not just the types that you are specifically focused on.
Right.
And so like the law has a lot of a role to play here, but I guess my point with regulation is like, I'm actually eager for Tom to answer this, because my sense is that the company's incentives are in the last 5 to 6 years, they were in some beat up in the past for contributing to all of these societal ills, and that there is and that there, because of that, there was kind of a sense of like, well, let's try to resolve this because maybe regulation will happen or maybe something will happen. And it became very clear that regulation was not only not going to happen, but not super possible in any constructive way, but also that maybe they had it didn't matter. Like, I mean, Facebook is a great example. They spent $300 million setting up the oversight board to try to, in part, to try to address these types of problems. And it has not reputationally particularly like redeemed Meta at all. Like, I think that there is like, good, like, quote, like kind of the good acts, the voluntary self-regulatory measures that the companies took, if they took them, did not go very far. And so as soon as there's an economic downturn and costs are then the cost for those types of kind of social good social good projects stays the same and overall revenues decline, they're going to be the first thing on the chopping block. And so I think that
and we've seen that already with a lot of these layoffs.
I mean, yes, and it's social, yes, no, I mean, like that is literally what happened. And I wrote a kind of a post about this, about how, like, even though we were complaining about it, we were amidst, like, so, and I say us, I mean social scientists and people who were focused on what the platforms could do, that we were actually kind of in this 5 to 6 year golden age of social, of like there being kind of social good, social actor kind of attempts by the company to do these things absent regulatory pressure, and now that's gone. Right. And who knows if it's going to come back.
Right. I mean, on the regulatory front, I think I'd love to hear from Tom, but the one thing I wanted to say quickly is that I think what you're saying is right, that in the US, these kind of like content-based regulation is not going to happen. But my sense is it's definitely happening in Europe, and they have like quite different norms around that. Like, you know, if long time laws in certain countries banning, you know, Holocaust mythology and stuff like that, and that, whatever, you know, like false claims about the Holocaust not happening. And I think there's much more of a sense of like, it's okay to regulate speech that is bad. And then one of the things that's weird about being a global company is you have to respond to those kinds of regulatory pressures also. So anyways, I think it's interesting. But Tom, I would love to hear what you think about the company's incentives around regulation versus just like and the trade-off between engagement and retention. Because if you have policies that may reduce engagement, that seems like a bad thing, but maybe it's okay if it increases retention in the long run and all of that.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a super important point, that actually across the world, a ton of countries have passed all sorts of misinformation laws. And as a matter of fact, as far as I'm aware, the platforms mostly roll over. They comply with whatever they're told, and then they don't stand on principle, and they take down what they're told to take down. But it's also probably important, I think, at least in most countries, still regulation is only a very small minority share of all of the content moderation they're doing. It's only a tiny percentage, that they're going far beyond of most regulation. In fact, most regulation, the things that they're forced to do, they would have done anyway. That they're going to take down terrorist stuff, child porn. They're going to take down hate speech. They're going to take down incitement, using much broader definitions than regulatory definitions. So most of the time, when we think about regulation and we think about outcomes, is that actually the platforms are doing most of stuff far beyond what they're regulated to do, at least the big platforms. And then it's a puzzle of why they're doing it, and they're often spending 5% of their overall costs on data scientists, on content raters, on all these different structure for moderating content, which doesn't seem, A, it's not legally required, B, it typically doesn't show payoffs in terms of user engagement, that these are only tiny shares of the content anyway, that if you run A/B tests, there are only tiny effects on user engagement. I think the reason they're doing it is because advertisers would freak out if they have that content, primarily, but also a whole bunch of other parties will freak out. The media will freak out.
As we've seen with Twitter, right? Like
exactly. Yeah. So I think that if we're trying to think about why do platforms moderate, what are the fundamental determinants on moderation, number one is the advertisers, and then there's an interesting question of why the advertisers care so much, and then there's a whole bunch of other parties who are going to have some strong preferences about what type of content appears on platforms. And of course, I mean, we shouldn't talk about platforms as if they're amoral actors. They also, the owners and the executives, they have moral feelings about what they want to be complicit with, and so they also make, moral decisions.
Although I think it's interesting on that one that like there are different kinds of moralities and ideologies, because my sense, at least from the outside, is that for Facebook or for Meta, Zuckerberg seems to have a real commitment to that kind of free market of ideas kind of ideological perspective that then they may push in the other direction.
Yeah, so I would, Zuckerberg gave a famous speech in, I think it was 2018, Georgetown, where he very much sort of went in on this free market stuff and free speech. I'm going to say that he sent contradictory signals internally inside the company, that he wanted a he didn't want any weeds in his garden, but he also wanted to have clean hands. So he wanted to be, he didn't want to have any bad content on there, but he didn't want to be seen to be getting rid of the bad content and making judgments about what's good and bad. And so, he was telling all his reports, this is what I want. I don't want any bad content. I don't want you to do anything about the bad content. Come back and, and what are they going to do? What they did is they launched a whole bunch of things which weren't technically targeting the bad content, but in practice they did. And I think that's the way that all of the platforms operate. Zuckerberg, for a period, I don't think he's quite as ideological now. For a period was talking a lot about free speech. Musk, for a period, was talking a lot about free speech. It's a nice thing to talk about, but in practice, if you're going to run a platform, especially in one that's going to keep the big advertisers on, you can't have a free speech platform.
Yeah, I want to just make one caveat, which is that which I think is invisible, that we kind of forget because this is the way that it has just developed, but that these are American companies primarily. And I do think that and this is one of the things that kind of I've studied and written about, but I think that the idea that there are American norms by the people who created these initial content moderation rules is actually a huge kind of part of this, just as so a lot of them were lawyers, a lot of them were American lawyers, and a lot of American lawyers at Google, at Facebook, at Twitter, actually used to push back more against nation states kind of regulating and trying to force them to take down a lot of speech. That has kind of gone out the window in the last, I would say that was that's the early aughts was you would hear of kind of the head of YouTube content going to Thailand to argue about taking down videos about the Thai king, type of thing, and not refusing to comply, or turning off Facebook in Pakistan because they wouldn't comply with certain types of government takedown. So there is a really different response in comparison to TikTok, which comes from a completely different cultural standpoint, and which is fine taking down 15%, 20% of their content before it's ever published or spread widely on the platform in order to curate and meet advertisers in order to curate virality, in order to curate certain types of ideas. And there isn't this concern with we should keep up all the content and just take down the worst. There isn't a concern with the baby in the bathwater.
Right.
There just isn't. And I don't want to I don't want to attribute all of that to cultural differences, but I do think it's kind of a fundamental contrast in approaches. And I think it's an interesting one because I honestly think that TikTok's is going to be a much lower operational cost over time. And that might mean that it's dominant, and that might mean potentially kind of devastating things for online censorship and kind of the ideas that we spread and what we see online.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So a comment from the audience came in that's interesting, so I feel like we've been talking about there's regulation, or the threat of regulation is one pressure on tech companies. Another one is advertisers. But the third one is the sort of morals or values of the people that are the big decision makers. But another one is the workers themselves, and the extent to which the company has a need to keep the workers happy to prevent them from quitting or taking other options. And at least on a small scale, we've certainly seen that, where we have some grad students who are extremely good and who worked at tech companies and then quit sort of post 2016 because they felt like it was not a good place to be. So I'm curious, Tom, what you think about that.
Yeah, it's I think that is a very important dimension of how decisions get made. As you say, I don't have a super good idea of how to figure out how consequential it is in the end. That it's true, I think there's pretty strong selective recruitment to different firms, of people being willing to work there based on their reputation and based on what they do. And also I'd say that people who work in content moderation often treat it as a calling, that they identify with it. They're not just there to do what they're told, which can both have good and bad aspects to it. It's very difficult, I think, I find it difficult to make generalizations about what that does to the overall outcomes of how content ends up getting moderated. Yeah.
I will say that, and I'm curious if you actually agree with this, Tom. I will say that, like, I think the economic downturn and just like layoffs, like, decreases the power of workers.
Yeah.
And and this is observational, completely qualitative, based on like weeks and weeks inside Facebook. But I think that there might be strong motivations, particularly among these are, again, a lot of them American companies, for H-1B visas. And that really actually severely limits like the amount that you're willing to protest, especially. And I think that is a very, and you kind of like, I think that that's actually kind of greatly unappreciated, that like how much that, how valuable that is to individuals, to their families, and how people will not protest or leave companies or whistleblow when, like, their entire family is like dependent on them being a good employee.
And I feel like there's a lot of discussion about that when Musk started firing everyone at Twitter, and being like, okay, now you're going to come and you're going to work like crazy. And I feel like, why are people doing that? Like, well, a lot of people don't really have any choice.
No, a lot of people. The only people I know that are still at Twitter are actually people that are in that situation, either for that or for health insurance reasons. So
yeah. Okay, so another question from the audience that goes back a little bit to something that we were talking about earlier that I think is really interesting is to say, like, you guys were talking about part of what makes misinformation spread on social media is that it's decentralized, and there's more sort of centralized organizations do less sharing of misinformation because they're worried about alienating viewers or things like that. But the question is, how does that sit with the observation that there are certain centralized organizations that seem to be spreading a lot of misinformation and disinformation, or have sort of made that a part of the business model, like Fox News, opinion desk kind of, Tucker Carlson sort of things, where there it's like clearly centralized, but also clearly making lots of false claims. And maybe more generally, what I think is interesting to think about is the extent to which the misinformation on social media is this kind of bottom-up viral spreading process, which I think is the way a lot of people have conceptualized it from 2016 on, when people started talking about it, is, oh, the problem is anybody can post anything they want, there's no gatekeeping, and then it goes viral, versus a view of misinformation on social media being like, okay, anybody can post anything they want, but then nobody's going to see it. And the way things really go viral is when elites that have huge numbers of followers decide to either post something themselves or pick up and amplify something some random person shared. And so I think there's a sort of a bit of a question of like, how much of the problem is really the decentralization versus the centralization, versus is it something that, like, social media allows elites to talk directly to their followers whenever they want without any kind of intermediary or something like that. It's like another view on the social media misinformation problem. So I don't know, curious either of your thoughts on the decentralization, centralization thing, and the bottom up versus top down spreading.
I can go first quickly. I think Fox News is a great example. I would say that if you tried to map out the that Fox News is somewhat of an outlier, and among the centralized sources of distribution, there's some variation, but still the variation in decentralized, or the dispersion or the amount of misinformation or unreliable information tends to be on average larger in decentralized media. It is worth noting that Fox News does face some constraints that I think they the advertisers, so this is my understanding, is that a lot of the major advertisers already were boycotting Tucker Carlson for a long time, and that was a significant constraint, that they were monetizing that time a lot less, but he was a draw for the channel's other shows. But also, secondly, my understanding is Fox News gets a lot of cable fees, so they're less dependent on advertising income. So there are a couple of reasons why, both that they do face a significant constraint from advertisers, but also that the reason why they feel less constrained is partly because they're less dependent on advertising money. With respect
That's
to
super interesting. Just as one thought on that, not to sound like marketing professor over here, but it is sort of interesting how it seems like advertisers are playing a key role here in creating the incentive to not have bad stuff on platform.
Yeah, I think, sorry, you Kate.
No, I think that that's actually true. And I think this is like, there has been, Shoshana Zuboff famously wrote kind of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and kind of came down very hard on the idea that ads are this terrible kind of scourge and creating all of these capitalist incentives. I actually for a number of years, I kind of lightly agreed with that. And now I think I more strongly disagree with kind of that normative judgment in a very kind of, it's not sophisticated in the kind of how it addresses all of the different ways that advertising actually incentivizes and serves democratic purposes via capitalism. So for one thing, I think that subscription-based models like Fox News actually encourage this type of bubble of they have a locked in viewership that comes there for their misinformation. And so they don't care that they're putting misinformation out there until the very unlikely event that happens, which is that they actually get sued for something that rises to the level of defamation and get called on it. And so I think that, and in fact, I think that advertising allows it makes, even going back to newspapers, it makes it so that the banker gets the paper delivered to his door for $15 a month, but the bootblack can still buy it for 5 cents on any given day. And that is a subsidization process that has an overall kind of it has an overall societal good that I think advertising contributes to, that people kind of take advantage of. The thing about it is that of course, no one wants to think that at the end of the day, we are basically at the whim of all of these corporations trying to sell shit. That's kind of depressing. And so I do think that there has to be we can try to build some of those kind of foundation. I think what we want to do is to try to kind of figure out ways to create guardrails or guidelines that are recapitulate some of the things that advertising has taught us are the right practices or the best mechanisms, without it being, I think markets respond really quickly to changing norms faster than the law does. And so that is one of the reasons the markets are the driving force in all of these, we're coming back to this being kind of the end of the day, the kind of the driving thing that makes these companies pay attention.
So I want to add one more thing. I think I agree with all that. And it is a sort of Faustian bargain. It's not beautiful. And I think that the history of mass media funded by advertising started in, let's say, the 19th century, has meant that mass media has always been kind of bowdlerized and sort of castrated in some sense. That there's a whole bunch of topics which, as an editor of a TV station or newspaper or magazine, you're not going to touch. You're not going to touch sexuality. You're not going to touch religion. You're not going to touch ethnicity. You're not going to touch a lot of political issues. So a lot of mass media has always been just a very constrained subset of uncontroversial topics, and that's been both good in the sense that it's violent populist movements have had a hard time getting a platform, but also obviously bad because all sorts of fringe beliefs or practices or any kind of criticism of existing institutions is not allowed in the mainstream media. So ideally, there will be some kind of compromise where there will be some kind of way of getting out of that bind and keeping the goods but not the bads. But I don't think that we should be crossing our fingers for us to invent that business model in the very short term.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I sort of hadn't put all of that together until this discussion right now, but it's fascinating to think about advertisers as sort of like the white knight in this situation, and then the, like, you know, as you said, the Faustian bargain nature of that sort of thing. Yeah. So I guess for the second half of that question, which was a little bit different about, like, to what extent do you think that it makes sense to be thinking about misinformation as this bottom-up viral spreading phenomena versus a kind of top-down elite-driven phenomena? Because I think that's important for thinking about how you successfully intervene. Like, how much of it is about trying to educate or like empower individual users to not accidentally amplify things, versus is this about somehow changing the incentives or for the, like, fairly, like, much smaller number of people with big followings?
I can say something from a technical point of view, that I think that if we're going to have a very precise focus of, like, on social media platforms, where does the distribution come from? I'm going to say the majority comes not from the being pushed by elites. And a couple of examples are that misinformation is much more likely in the stuff which is sort of deep reshares, which goes through long reshare change, rather than directly from someone you subscribe to. And I think that was always a big difference between Instagram and Facebook. I think that the best understanding of why there was much less misinformation on Instagram was that it didn't have these reshare chains. That was not part of the mechanics. So that you would subscribe to someone, you'd see what they said, whereas on Facebook, someone would come up with some inflammatory post and then it would just go viral by itself. So I think that, of course, the question is right, that there's a certain amount of stuff which is going around the traditional gatekeepers and getting directly to constituents from the elite or high-ranking people. But I still think if we're talking about why social media platforms have this high rates of misinformation, especially 5 or 10 years ago, I think it was mainly through this. The majority share was not through the elite speaking directly to followers, but through this community propagation.
The dynamic nature of this that you're pointing out is interesting also, which is when we say, like, social media is X, we can say, like, right now or like 5 years ago or whatever, but it's very much a moving target. And so it may be that at this point, if they've sort of effectively, at least the big platforms, have substantially reduced a lot of that kind of misinformation spreading, it leaves the kind of more traditional top-down channel as the channel that sort of survives.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind in these discussions more generally, is how much of a moving target this is. And, like, there was a paper, or maybe 2 papers recently, looking at, like, the YouTube recommendation algorithms, and to what extent, you know, YouTube is sort of sending people down rabbit holes of extremism, and concluded that it wasn't really, and there wasn't.
Yeah, is that Josh Tucker's work at NYU?
Yeah, and I think Benny Nyhan was on it too. And I think that, like, at least when we were talking to people at Google when that paper came out, and they were like, yeah, that's right, but it's because we spent so much hard work, like, getting rid of those rabbit holes, you know?
I feel like this is something that is kind of forgotten, and I'll say it so that Tom doesn't have to, but I do think he said before that there are moral actors at these companies, and these people, like, people go, I mean, I have made my life's work so far, basically, like, not talking to the C-suite, not talking to the people who are highly incentivized by dollar signs, and talking to people on the factory floor about, like, what it is they're trying to do from the bottom up within companies to save the bottom up within platforms, which is kind of a noble kind of tradition, this idea that there are, like, great ideas and people want to, like, most people want to use these platforms for good and not evil. And most people want to take down the worst of the worst stuff. I mean, as like Tom says, all content moderation standards started with well, not all, but like, I would say that like Facebook started with like if it makes you feel bad, take it down type of normative kind of understanding of like, no Hitler, no swastikas, no like, you know, I mean, it was like some, I mean, really basic normative stuff. And this has become much more evolved. It's now like 8,000 words of standards, and like they're carefully defined and carved out. But it is this idea that like there are mostly good people running these things, and most of them are very far afield from the economic decisions of the company. They're not actually in charge of, you know, and if they were, and if, you know, to the contrary, what they're doing is continuing to ask the company for more money to do what they are supposed to be doing well. And kind of like, and so, yeah, I think that is a really important part of this kind of narrative.
Yeah, totally. And I think that
more in the next couple of years.
Yeah, totally. And I think that like when I give talks about this stuff, I very regularly people will say, well, do the social media companies really fix this problem or not? And my response is always, it's not a well-formed question, because the social media company isn't like one entity, but it's like, you know, thousands and thousands of people. And like the people that are on the team dealing with misinformation and trust and safety, like all of the people that I've interacted are really genuinely committed to trying to make things better. But as you're saying, they're also not the people with the power. And so a lot of the question is, in these very hierarchical organizations, how effectively can the people on the factory floor that are working on trying to, you know, like doing really good, hard, sincere work trying to deal with these problems, so how effectively are they able to get sort of heard up the chain of command? All right, well, I think that we're at the end. So thank you guys so much for this really engaging and thought-provoking conversation. It was really great to have both of you here.
Thank you.
Awesome. Executive Director of the IDE. We're moving into a 30-minute break until 1:45 Eastern Time. Please join us this afternoon for 2 sessions, one on responsible AI and the other on the future of social media and emerging ecosystems. Thanks for joining us. See you in a few bit.